Good morning. One of the things that I've witnessed and learned as I've been raising kids, the idea of discipline in relationship to those things that are done wrong it's a hard thing to figure out as a parent. I mean, it really is. Do you discipline based on the size of the problem or the cost of the consequences or the outcome? So as an example, when my boys were little, and they're not little anymore, but when they were little, 5, 6, 7 years old, it was one thing to say to them, don't throw the ball in the house. And I grew up with a stepdad that was quite abusive. My dad and mom were divorced when I was about 4, so my stepdad came in the picture not long after that, and until he passed away in a car accident just before I turned 10, he was pretty responsive to the things that we did wrong, and I would look back now and say, in a pretty close to abusive manner. He would fly off the handle pretty easily, and his response was always substantial. As I look back now, I might even say over the top. I remember saying something wrong or breaking something and being beaten with a belt until the buckle flew off the belt. I remember playing in the yard and I would do something that he didn't feel like was appropriate. He would take his boot off and throw it across the yard and knock me off my feet. So that was kind of his way of discipline. And I knew he grew up in a harder time, and he was a Vietnam vet before they understood what PTSD was. And so, I mean, I look back on that, I don't say I'm making excuses, but I can see how and why he would react that way. And so my initial reactions when I first started raising kids were, if anything didn't go the way I wanted it to as a parent, I would go off the deep end. I would scream, I would yell, I would raise my voice. I never got physically abusive with my children. But I don't have a problem with corporal punishment when it's used properly and appropriately and for the right reason. Enough about me. No, not really. So when my boys at 5, 6, 7 years old would be throwing a ball in the house, and I would say, stop throwing the ball in the house. Or mom would say, don't throw the ball in the house, take it outside. If they continue to throw the ball in the house, which is pretty common for a boy to do when you say don't throw the ball in the house, it's like an overwhelming temptation to now throw the ball in the house. But if the ball being thrown in the house ends up knocking the television off of its table and onto the floor, and it crashes and shatters all of the floor, here's where most parents have a hard time drawing the line. See, if they knocked over a tea glass and it broke the glass, that's $5 or $6 to buy another glass. But if it broke the television, now we're talking a couple of $100 or more to replace the television. If it went through a window, oh goodness, now you're talking $500, $600, $700 or more to fix the window. If it broke something personal and precious, some family heirloom or gift that we can't easily replace, then now you've really done it. And I think the hard thing for many of us is understanding that disobedience and the level of damage or destruction or people that it can hurt as a result of our disobedience is not always the best way to measure the depth of the disobedience. As we're digging deeper into this study, I just want to take today and looking at Leviticus 26, just the encapsulated verses of 14 and 15. Because we're about to dig into the list of all of the punishments, if you will, the negative consequences as a result of being disobedient to God. But in the same way that we look at that scenario, if my children were playing in the house and I said, don't play with the ball in the house, and they broke something significant, is the punishment equal to, or is the response equal to the value of the thing that they've broken? Or is there some other way to equate the value of their disobedience? And many of us immediately jump to, our reaction is going to be in representation to or in contrast to the value of the thing that was broken. But the bigger problem is not the thing that's broken. It's the rebellion to begin with. And part of the reason is that rebellion is our nature of sin. It's born in us. You don't have to teach a 2-year-old to be rebellious. It's their nature. No one has to teach them to lie. It's their nature. Obedience is not their nature. And that's been the case since the fall, since the dawn of time, since Adam. Now, we have invented ways to rebel in society, in our cultures, in our behaviors, in our marital relationships, in our father-son relationships. We've invented ways to rebel. They're so very creative. It is absolutely amazing. Things that we know are not what authorities would expect of us, and yet we do them, and then sometimes cause others to do them. In Scripture, Jesus talks about a culture of people who did that. He said, it'd be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the sea than that you, by your own rebellion and behavior, cause one of these little ones to sin. And yet we do, on a regular basis. It's an ongoing thing. When I look at the cost of rebellion, the defiance against, the pushback against authority, whether it's mom and dad or it's civil authorities or it's against God, the cost of that is so significant. It was probably by the time my boys were 5 and 6 that my heart had already said to me, it's not the value of the television that you need to be concerned with. It's the cost of defiance and disobedience. And so my wife and I had a long discussion about this, and we both agreed. And then we set out on a course to say, I don't care if they're 5, 15, 25, 35, or 55. The cost of defiance and rebellion is so much greater because it leads to defiance against legal authorities, defiance against civil authorities, defiance against God. And the price to be paid for that is high. It's really, really high. I don't just want to punish my children for the thing that they've broken or the thing that they've lost or the thing that they've done or even the results or the outcome of their behavior. I want them to understand that there's immediate, implicit, very clear, and very severe cost for disobedience. Now, when I say that, I want you to understand that obedience doesn't happen in action. Obedience happens inside. Our humanness is 3 different levels: the physical body, the soul, which is mind, will, and emotions, and our spirit. And if our mind, will, and emotions, our ability to choose our own actions, our ability to think through the consequences and relate that to the choosing of our own actions, our will, if our thoughts and our will are in cahoots together to do the wrong thing, then we will feel like the wrong thing is the right thing. We've got to get that in line, not to what our body wants. You've seen the Sprite commercials, obey your thirst. No, don't obey your thirst. Unless you're hungry and thirsting for the righteousness of God. Don't obey your thirst. That tells you that your soul and your spirit should be submitted to your body, and that's not right. And it will cost you. If you allow your feelings, your emotions, your physical body to drive your choices, you will lose. You should be driven by the Spirit of God. The Spirit in you should be at one with God, and your mind, will, and emotion should be surrendered to that Spirit, your body obeying your soul. Now, why is all that so very important? Because sometimes we ask the question on this earth, and Romans chapter 8 even deals with, I believe it's chapter 8. I'll look it up and make sure. In the book of Romans, Paul talks about surrender to the authorities that are above you. You need to be a good citizen on this earth. You need to understand that the authorities appointed above you are appointed by me. Yes, they're going to make mistakes. Yes, they're going to ask you to do things that are in defiance to me. And there's going to be a line where I'm going to say, God is going to say, obey me and forget what they said. They've crossed the line and I will punish them, but you do not need to do what they're telling you to do. If they're telling you to murder children for no reason, don't listen to them. But if the authorities over you are telling you to do something and it doesn't defy what God has said, then you need to surrender to them because God has appointed them authority and God will hold them accountable. That's a significant thing. But we tend to look for ways to be rebellious. We want our own way. If it feels good, do it. Do what you want to do. Defiance in the public is a growing trend. It becoming a bigger and bigger problem. But it's not a defiance just for the sake of change. It's not about I want freedom or I want independence. Sometimes it is. Sometimes I want equality. Sometimes I want my children to be treated the same way your children are treated. That's perfectly legitimate. But sometimes it's defiance for the sake of defiance. Sometimes it's defiance just to create disruption. Sometimes it's defiance just because they don't recognize the authority of anyone. They've become their own authority. Well, that's exactly what these two verses are talking about in Leviticus 26, verses 14 and 15. And he breaks it down pretty explicitly to say, look, I'm not just talking about the violation of a simple law. I'm not talking about, well, you broke the television. I'm talking about the condition of your heart that allowed you to reach the place that your actions caused destruction. I'm not even talking about the destruction itself. I'm talking about the condition of your heart. And so my wife and I made an agreement as parents early on that our children would face consequences, not because of what happened when they rebelled, but because of the condition of their heart that allowed them to rebel. Not because of the outcome of their defiance, but because of the heart of their defiance. And there would be swift and immediate recompense to remind them, you must obey. You need to learn that now in your life as a little kid, because when you grow up, you will end up in jail as a juvenile. You'll end up in prison as an adult. You'll end up an outcast of all society for all of your human life if you perpetually live in defiance. This is not about behavior. This is a condition of the heart. So here's the way God says that in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 14. And I believe this is the NIV. It may be the ESV version. This is my New King James Version, Open Bible Study Edition. You know, when I read from just a reading standpoint, I use the Message. When I study, I use NIV or New King James, sometimes the ESV, just depending on what I'm looking for. Today, we're in the New King James Open Study Bible. Leviticus chapter 26, verse 14 says, "But if you do not obey me, comma, and do not observe all these commandments." Now, I want you to understand there is a reason, and we'll dig into it later, but there's a reason that he says, obey me and observe all these commands. Obey me and. There's two different ideas there linguistically. Obeying me is one thing. Obeying and observing all of my commands is a different thing. One is, I'm telling you right now to do this thing. That's obedience right now. Obey me. All of my commands means to stay within the realm of the things that I've told you before. I may not be speaking to you right this minute, but I have certain expectations for you. All of my children drive now. And the ones that are still on my insurance policy, I don't walk out the door with them every time they get in the car and go, remember, speeding tickets are going to cost you dearly because they cause my insurance rates to go up. You better be ready to look for your own policy. You better be ready to pay your own tickets or take defensive driving and get it off my record. You better be ready to be financially responsible for that behavior because I will hold you accountable. I don't have to tell them that every day. That expectation has already been set. That's what God's saying here. There are going to be things I'm going to tell you right now, and when I tell you, you better do it. But there are those things that we already have an understanding of. All my commandments, don't forget about those either. He goes on to say, if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, and if you despise my statutes. That's one of the challenges that we see in our cultures and societies today. I heard a young man tell his mother not too long ago, he just said outright, listen, I think it's stupid that the law says we can't smoke pot. So I'll be the one to go to jail if they decide that they're going to jail me for smoking pot because I believe I have a right to smoke pot. She said, that's just a bad choice because you going to jail will be no different than all the other people who have gone to jail. And the fact that your testimony says, I'm going to jail because I would rather smoke pot than obey you. Basically, all you're saying is I decided to be defiant, premeditated. I don't care what you think about it. I would rather you put me in jail than to surrender that. Now, once you get in jail, you're not going to be able to smoke pot. So what have you actually accomplished in your defiance? Despise my statutes. It's that condition of the heart that says, I don't think you have the right to tell me what to do. I don't care what you think about it. I just forget it. I'm not doing what you tell me to do. I don't care about your commandments. My heart despises the fact that you even think you can tell me what to do. Next, if your soul upwards my judgments, mind, will, emotions, I don't feel like obeying the law. When I think about it, I think the law should be different than it is. I just choose not to obey the law. In fact, I think it's unfair for God to do blank. I think it's unfair that the Bible says I can't do blank. I think God was out of bounds when he told me I can, and so I choose to do this, and I feel like I should get away with that. I know this is jumping off in the weeds, and this is deep subject, and probably in the audience that watches, there are some disagreements about it. We don't have to get all political on it, but let me be real clear. One of the first pieces of written prose that I wrote when I was 19 years old was a heartfelt conversation that I had with God. And in that conversation, I decided, and I still hold this value, that abortion is a choice. It's just a really bad and stupid one. I have a choice to get behind the wheel of my car drunk and may kill someone in the process. That doesn't make cars illegal. It doesn't make driving illegal, but it does mean there will be a consequence if I'm caught driving drunk. There will be a price to pay for that. And if that causes the death of another person, the price for driving intoxicated goes up, goes up, goes up, goes up, goes up. Abortion, I think, is the same way. It is a choice, and there is a price to be paid for it. And you cannot pretend that it's not a choice, and you cannot pretend that there's not a price to be paid for it. I also believe it's murder. But in the same way I have a right to kill someone and pay the consequences for it, a woman has a right to commit abortion or to exterminate the life of that child and pay the consequences for it. What he's saying here is when you abhor my judgments, when your soul says, I don't care what God thinks about it, I'm doing what I want to do, there's a high price to be paid for that. So that you do not perform all my commandments, but break my covenant. Here's what he's telling you. We read yesterday all the good things that can happen when God is blessing you, when God is looking out of your life. And I'm going to go through those and break them down. There are 16, I believe, is what I found. 16 benefits to obedience and 41 costs of disobedience. We're going to look at each of those starting on Monday. We're going to break them down and kind of look at how they impact our life. I don't know if I'll do 1 a day or 5 a day or whatever, but I'll break them down over the weekend and be ready for that on Monday. But I want you to understand that the disobedience of God, our disobedience toward God, is not about just did I follow that specific law or that specific law. It's the attitude and condition of our heart. It's the attitude and condition of the rebellion of our soul. And it's whether or not we allow God to be in control, to be in charge. That's a challenge for all of us. It is a heart condition, and there is a price to be paid for the soul of rebellion that supersedes and outweighs all of the price to be paid for the consequences or the outcome of your disobedience and your defiance. I want you to just settle on how obedience is a heart condition, not just a behavior condition and a consequences condition. There are consequences to be paid for the condition of your heart, not just the outcome of your defiance. So we're going to talk about that next week. Until then, I am J Loren Norris, and you've been watching Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.